A very good evening, everyone. Orion Black Swan welcomes you to the launch of our book, Women in the Worlds of Labor, Interdisciplinary and Intersectional Perspectives, edited by Mary E. John and Meena Gopal. India has one of the world's lowest work participation rates for women, an issue that is only belatedly receiving the attention it needs, whether from women's and other social movements, the agendas of development and the state, or from the public and media at large. This timely volume addresses the multiple worlds of women's labor in the context of the current crisis besetting women's work in contemporary India. How in India is work defined and recognized in the first place when the so-called formal sector of employment pertains to less than 6% of the entire female workforce? What are the theoretical legacies that require greater engagement, from paid and unpaid work, conceptions of care and social reproduction, the nature of capitalism, to notions of caste, class, gender, and sexuality, in order to make women's work and struggles more legible? To address and to critically assess some of these concerns, we are privileged to have here with us today a most distinguished panel of very well-known scholars, activists, and published authors with a diversity of expertise and interests. It is my pleasure to introduce the chair for today, Ritu Devan, former director, Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy, University of Mumbai. She was, until retirement, the first ever woman director of the Department of Economics. She is vice president of the India Society of Labour Economics and founder member of the first Center for Gender Economics in Asia. Her wide-ranging research, which interlinks academics, advocacy, and action, focuses mainly on gender issues relating to the marginalized and socio-economically vulnerable. Meena Gopal is Professor, Advanced Center for Women's Studies, School of Development Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. She researches on gender and informal labor, social movements, and public health. She is also part of the Forum Against Oppression of Women, Bombay. Karuna Dietrich B. Lenga is Assistant Professor, School of Arts and Sciences, Azim Premji University, Bangalore. Her research focuses on the history of labor and artisanal work, particularly in the informal sector, and the informalization of labor in India. Niharika Banerjee is Associate Professor, School of Liberal Studies, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. Her research areas include sexuality studies, transnational feminisms, queer living and activisms in India, social theory, queer feminist research methods, and collaborative ethnography. Mahua Bandyopadhyay is Associate Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Delhi. Her work draws on the sociology of organizations, penology, urban sociology, and gender and masculinities. And Mary E. John is Professor and Acting Director, Center for Women's Development Studies, New Delhi, and has been working, writing, and publishing in the fields of women's studies and feminist politics for over 2 decades. A very, very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. And here's over to Professor Ritu Devan for opening today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Moina, for the introduction, and very much to Orient Black Swan, as well as TIS and CWDS for organizing this event on such an extremely urgent issue. I have been, I'm of course very honored and privileged to be part of this and to chair the session, primarily of course because the issue is so important, and also because I have very high regard for both the editors as well as the authors who are, I think several of them are there on the panel today, in the discussion today. Of course, I congratulate you all, and what I just like to say in the beginning, what I really liked very, very much is that this book is it's not only a significant contribution to the very, very critical issue of women and the worlds of labor. I think that term is extremely important. It also, what this book does is it extends the frontiers. It not only adds to the knowledge, but it extends the frontiers of knowledge, particularly of this debate. And this does in several ways, re-examining and reassessing the structures of what is called work, employment, labor, livelihoods. And also what it does is that it reviews and extends the methodological knowledge base, which is extremely essential. When I read the book, and I've read it at least 2 or 3 times, I've gained something every time, more and more from this. And what I particularly like is the way the book is introduced, because it's the introduction which Meena and Mary have done. It's not a predictable summary of the articles, which are there, but also what it does, that it identifies several fundamentals, both connected and disconnected, from the debates which centered on each of the sections which contain the book, which are very, very logically structured, I must say. So you have your conceptual perspectives, there's a histories of the present beyond invisibility. I think that was something which was extremely interesting. Labor from the margins, laboring in new times, as well as organizing women in context of the state in particular. The one, I think the central fulcrum of the entire book for me was that the problem in quotes, of women's labor is recharacterized as a crisis, the crisis of capitalism and of a deeply patriarchal state. And this, it combines with the perennial and unresolved issue of redefining and recognizing women's contribution to the economy, specifically here, of course, to the Indian economy. And it does this in myriad ways and very nuanced ways, which are really extremely commendable, both in terms of scholarship of feminist methodology, as well as in terms of locating the entire debate in the context of the process of development, or what I call de-development, which is really taking place in the last few years. I now request Meena Gopal to talk and present her, what she has to say about the book, how they conceived it, very much so. And thank you so much, Meena.
Thank you, Ritu, and thank you to colleagues at Orient Black Swan. This volume is a continuation of a long history of feminist conversations, as well as an expansion of the terrain of gendered labor with newer voices. I begin by acknowledging and thanking all the 20 contributing authors whose 19 essays brought life to this conversation. The volume has been a while in the making, we must admit, and I thank all colleagues at Orient Black Swan Publishers, first of all, for organizing this webinar and for being with us through the latter part of the journey, especially the supportive role during the pandemic in getting the volume out. So thank you very much. The volume began as a conference in 2014 at Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, which was jointly organized by Center for Women's Development Studies, Delhi, with Mary leading it, and the Advanced Center for Women's Studies at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, with the generous contribution of the Indian Council of Social Science Research, the ICSSR, both in Delhi and in Mumbai. Prior to this was a conference in 2011 at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, Delhi, which was actually the beginnings when Mary also suggested that we go ahead with such a work, with discussions on many dimensions of gendered labor, but with a focus on social reproduction. These dialogues build on a long history of feminist scholarship on labor for almost now 5 decades, grudgingly acknowledged within knowledge production in all disciplines, but which has led to the interdisciplinary field mentioned in part of the subtitle of the volume of Women's Studies, Gender Studies. Several of the authors are located in diverse academic disciplines, but their practice breaks free of the constraints of disciplinary boundaries and methodological barriers, as Ritu sort of flagged. The scholars are those who have already mounted disciplinary challenges in their respective spheres and have succeeded to a large extent. Their work serve as exciting examples for a new generation of scholars in our classrooms and research institutions. And that's our hope. For instance, again, I must apologize to pick on select examples, but hopefully this will urge all of us to read through the other essays as well. So for instance, N. Neeta's essay on exploring crises in female employment through an analysis of social categories does this effectively. Not only that, she unpacks the formidable National Sample Survey Organization data series elegantly using the conceptual frame of intersectionality, again mentioned in the second part of the subtitle, to lay out her argument. These discussions are swooped down to the everyday through the papers by Shailesh Kumar Darokar and P. Bindu Lakshmi, coming from seemingly opposed disciplinary locations to the above. Their very deep and empathetic ethnographic accounts and narratives indicate the open as well as the subversive negotiations around stigma, contempt, and exclusion experienced by women in caste-based sanitation work or moving transnationally for domestic work. Several essays thus speak to one another in the volume, and that is, I think, the highlight, just as if the authors were speaking to each other at a seminar. That conversation is quite live, weaving together concepts and frameworks, fulfilling our objective to foreground interdisciplinarity and intersectionality. Second, and the most significant aspect of the volume, reflecting the spirit of feminist scholarship, the writings intertwine scholarship and politics. In fact, going a step ahead to even challenge their binary representation, as is usually the case. Here again, there is an immense diversity, be it the eloquent analysis of the resistance of women in the subsistence economy opposing mining companies in Odisha, or the removal of the layers of invisibility of the labors of persons with disabilities, or those of Hijra trans communities or even those who never considered themselves part of laboring classes, seeking recognition for their labors, like teachers, the Mithila artists, and the courtesans, who perform mujra. Finally, as is expressing the core of feminist scholarship, expanding the field with questions from the margins, often considered irrelevant or inconsequential. Several essays do this by interrogating the normative and the tried and tested. For instance, throwing light on long-forgotten but persistent subsistence economy among Adivasi communities, or queer persons signifying the heteronormative foundation of the division of labor, or seeing migration as resistance evident in anti-caste politics or in the newly emerging working classes, like the factory girls, the Anganwadi workers, and the self-employed microcredit borrowers. With that, I wish to thank Mary for her very spirited partnership in this happy journey. And I welcome the three panelists, Karuna, Niharika, and Mahua, whose work embodies strong disciplinary commitment with the feminist sensibility just reflected upon. And I thank them for introducing the book. And thank you, Ritu. Ritu, you're on mute, I think.
Yeah. Not only in terms of efficiently spoken in terms of time, but I think you got the actual essence of the entire, what you have lived with for the last 5 or 6 years after the conference. And I request Karuna to talk, please. 10 minutes each is what is allocated. Yeah. Thank you. Karuna is muted, so.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, there's some problem with my mic. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me here on this panel. I see this as a sign of the uniqueness of the book in bringing together different disciplines, because usually, I have circulated only in labor history conferences and not been part of contemporary discussions on women's labor. So thank you very much for having me here. I would begin with a few general comments on the book, and then later on I'll more focus on the historical essays, being a historian. Already the speakers before me have kind of mentioned and put it very effectively, the essence of the book and how it brings together different things. But I would again like to say that the two frameworks around which the essays are collected, which is interdisciplinarity and intersectionality, really come through in the book. And I mean, in being interdisciplinary rather than being in enclaves. I have experienced this in labor history. Labor history is a total enclave in which, women's labor barely kind of figures. And I mean, there have been a few pioneers who have been laboring there to kind of make women's labor also visible. So Samita Sen, or maybe in the work of Chitra Joshi and so on. So I mean, it's a welcome move to kind of bring together these different disciplines, and then these, and hopefully this will also push historians to work more on both interrogating the meta narratives of labor history, as well as kind of visibilizing women's labor historically. So there's already new work which is coming up, for example, on domestic workers and so on. But hopefully this push from, because usually the push has to come from, feminist spaces, so to say. The second framework, which is of intersectionality, again, the editors themselves in the introduction point to and clarify their approach to intersectionality, which in many contexts we know has become just superficial and symbolic. And so they clarify the way that they use it, and say that it's both close to the original intent, and also their attempt is to push it in new and productive directions. So in the original sense of visibilizing those who disappeared at intersections, but also, for example, signaling the interlocking effects of different axes of oppression. And so I think this very much comes through in many of the essays. But what I found also very interesting was that though the broader framework is intersectionality, it's not an exclusive framework. And the first few essays, which are more theoretical reflections on, on journeys of especially feminist scholars on trying to theorize women's work, it kind of welcomes or encourages readers to engage with different theoretical frameworks, and I think that is very useful. So, for example, for the first time when I read the essays, I thought, because it's very difficult to kind of get 19 essays together and to give them, an overarching framework. But I felt that this multiple engagement with different histories of theorizing also welcomes or encourages readers to kind of use their own understandings to engage with the articles as well. So you have these different theoretical frameworks, you have the conversations between these different theoretical frameworks, and as Mary puts it in her own essay, that that none of these, if we are willing to accept that none of these theories are total or totalizing, and that they are only partial, then very fruitful conversations are possible. And I feel that is a big strength of the book. This kind of invitation to use and to engage with different theories while reading all these different works which are interdisciplinary in nature, which use different methodologies, ranging, as has already been mentioned, from historical narratives to theoretical papers to hard data analysis to very rich ethnographies. Okay, so having said this, I would go on to kind of discuss the two papers which are written from the historical perspective. Again, I mean, being a historian, I feel, there are only two papers, but the historians are entirely to blame. I mean, it is because labor history rarely or doesn't engage enough with women's labor and women's work is the reason to that there are not more papers. So hopefully this will be a nudge to labor historians as well. So the two papers are those of Meena Gopal and Geeta Tatra. So Meena Gopal explores the history of the bead industry, and I mean, this is this is something that she's already worked on in the 1990s, but here in this paper, she goes back in time to explore the history of this industry. And she particularly looks at and analyzes the kind of the different terminologies that emerge in the discourses around industrialization and the economy. What she looks at actually is very important because it crosses the dividing line of independence. So usually historians stop at 1947, and many of the contemporary studies situate themselves either in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, wherever they are situated, and there is hardly a dialogue. But here,
sorry to interrupt. 3 minutes. 3 minutes more.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
Absolutely. So she examines the different forces which are engaged in shaping this discourse, and looks at different terminologies like the factory, the cottage industry, homework, and tries to track how they get inscribed and circumscribed by gender. So, how does this homework, especially this movement from factory to homework, which then is largely done by women, how does it get inscribed and circumscribed by gender? And she examines the different forces engaged in shaping the discourse and the trajectory of the BD industry, which is not just the state, it's the Congress party, it's ideologues like the Gandhians, and it's the courts, and as well as the trade unions. So it's a very rich work, and it also points to many things, the importance of dialogue between history and the present, because often informality and many the precariousness are all considered to be symbols or outcomes of neoliberalism. But when you go back in time, you find maybe not. So then how do you your analysis has to shift. So I think that is the fruitfulness of the dialogue between history and contemporary. And Geeta Tatra's work again does a very fantastic job in linking the past and the present, and it tracks the interplay of caste and patriarchy and work in the lives of erstwhile courtesans and performers in a space that increasingly becomes contested. So in her study, through the exploration of space, she manages to highlight the changing relationship of performers and the society around them. So the compound and the Congress House. So, in history, it's the compound. The compound is where the courtesans live. And the Congress House is where, was an important center of the Congress. But then later, in current times, it becomes the space occupied by middle class, gentrifying class. And so she explores the different tensions, which are different in history, historically, and are different now, but still, have the same kind of axis of gender, caste, and gender and caste playing out in quite different ways. So I think it throws up new kinds of insights. Finally, I just want to close. I won't go on this much, but I think some of the other essays bring another important factor, which is politics. And I think we need to reflect more on how to theorize this politics of women workers. During the pandemic, in a sense, the underbelly of the Indian economy was exposed. So on the one hand, we saw migrant workers marching who were mainly male. And on the other hand, we saw, nurses and women workers, care workers, again, exposed in a big way, but also in a sense politically. So for the first time, we also saw very visibly, strikes by nurses and by other caregivers fighting for their right to be recognized as workers. And that's also there in one of the articles. But I think, maybe as a kind of follow-up, one can try to find ways of theorizing women workers and their politicization. So how do you see them vis-a-vis the history of trade unionism in India? How do you see it vis-a-vis new forms of mobilization and organization? Sometimes it is in Adivasi areas and sometimes it's in the rural areas. So, but how can we conceptually, theoretically, can we at all bring them together, or will they remain isolated units? So, this is just, I would like to just end with a thought and a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Karuna. I'm very sorry to cut you short. In fact, one complaint against the three organizers is to keep the event only for 1 hour and 15 minutes. So if we go beyond a bit by 5-10 minutes, I think we should be forgiven. Karuna, you raised such an important issue, particularly labor history and how occlusive the discipline is. And I cannot tell you the struggle we face within economics, I mean, which is the most occlusive, I think, of all disciplines. Thank you so much, Karuna. And I request Niharika to please make a presentation.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you for inviting me to this panel. It has been an honor and also a learning process. And I echo Karuna in saying that I too usually reside in my little silo around queer living and activisms, wondering with my co-travelers in how to dialogue and act across disciplinary as well as activist boundaries. So this book for me has raised some questions around the theme of queer and trans labor and work. As an academic activist working in the area of queer studies, transnational feminisms, and collaborative ethnographies, a critical question that this book raised for me is, what does it mean to labor and work as a gender non-conforming person, as a Hijra Koti trans person, as a trans man, as a lesbian identifying person? One quickly realizes that the material and discursive reality that this question seeks to address is primarily undocumented in academia, even when Maya Sharma and Gayatri Reddy have referred to them in the early 2000s. From the mid-2000s onwards, Meena Gopal, Prabha Kotiswaran, and Swati Shah's scholarship have engaged with sex work, sexual labor, capital, and caste, which both Mary and Meena suggest are perhaps the only exceptions in feminist queer scholarship that directly tackle the question of labor. As Mary and Meena further point out, there are pressures other than poverty to understand the crisis of women's labor. In terms of queer and trans persons' lives, such pressures, even when part of a larger world of increasing political, economic deprivation and insecurity entrenched deeply in the materialities of caste, has drawn scant attention. Further, data sets are silent about the forms of livelihood and occupations in which queer and trans persons are involved. This situation juxtaposes the reality also that the LGBTQ acronym is gradually becoming a developmental category in the Indian context. In the larger global context, the abbreviation is often used in relation to questions of development and aid, and to hierarchize nations in terms of progress and backwardness. Questions of homophobia and transphobia become focal points around which global hierarchies are produced, as seen in how the World Bank divides nations as backward and forward. Yet, questions of labor and livelihood get lost in deep silences around the matter. So typically we, and by we I mean those of us who are part of queer and trans groups and are interested in such questions, rely on anecdotes and or those reports produced by collectives and organizations, but never reach academic circles. This book, therefore, to my mind, is the first of its kind in calling out those involved in queer studies to urgently engage with the world of laboring trans and queer persons in India, while simultaneously connecting us, that is, those interested in queer studies, to the interlocking and intersectional dimensions of labor and work. Now, in the context of scholarship in the US, some studies point to the linkages between working class queers and queers of color with the labor movement. The United States has had a layered history of union organizing by queer and trans persons in factories and unorganized service industries. A queer justice labor agenda actively works to bring the carceral realities that working class trans and queer persons encounter in their lives that are about the workplace, but also escape the workplace. The fact that queer and trans persons of color make up a large section of low-wage service sectors in the US economy is now documented. For instance, Hollybog and Weiss's work deploys the term queer precariat to refer to the large section of unorganized and non-unionized LGBTQ identifying workers who remain invisibilized within scholarly discussions and the broader LGBTQ movements. The invisibility of a discussion of economic insecurities in the queer and sexuality rights movements, and the invisibility of the effects of expressing, identifying, and or practicing a non-heteronormative way of life in discussions of labor rights has not just been a pressing issue in the US, but as this book very crucially reminds us, in the Indian context as well. Having said that, post reading down of Section 377, we increasingly see corporate India jumping into the diversity and inclusion bandwagon to provide partner benefits such as insurance coverage, safe workspaces, etc. This corporate policy change, while welcome, is limited in its scope and appeal. While we can be confident that the D&I policies will in time settle to ensure work securities and benefits in the formal sector, the workers in the informal sector are left to fend for themselves in deeply gendered occupations and without dignity. Sunil Mohan and Rumi Harish's work points to the need not just for sustained forms of collectivization and organizing in the informal sector, but also to the indignity of labor in a context where workers are graded hierarchically along the lines of caste. What happens to trans hijras, kotis, trans men, or single women in the informal economic structures? Labor that is involved in sex for work, to use Swati Shah's term, basti, courier and food delivery, driving, securing offices and malls, cooking in restaurants, and many other kinds of service-related occupations is, in addition to being precarious because of its economic insecurities, is determined by and determines gender roles. Such labor, therefore, is even more devalued. Thus, as Swati Shah urgently underscores, the world of work in an incredibly saturated labor market needs urgent attention. The fault lines of an oversaturated labor market have burst open during the pandemic. As Nandkarni and Swarnim, who doesn't write in this book, underline, trans and queer persons have been rendered further disposable, homeless, and incarcerated during the pandemic. That many have lost their already precarious livelihood options has been repeatedly shared by friends and allies, driving several of us to get funds for rations and relief work. The organization that I am a part of, Sappho for Equality, through their ration and relief operations, with 77 individuals in South Bengal, has come face to face with the gravity of the loss of livelihoods, out of which close to 50% are from marginalized caste backgrounds. Out of these 77 individuals, close to 40% were only able to complete higher secondary education. In North Bengal, in our interaction with 300 plus single women, with the majority from OBC, Dalit and Adivasi backgrounds, we saw how the income from small farming practices, tailoring, and tea plantation work quickly dried up as the lockdown hit. The imbrication of sexuality and gender with political economy, as Swati Shah's chapter demonstrates, has much to offer to understand the lived realities of invisibilization and survival. So in the end, this book calls to urgently document and analyze how casteist and racialized economic structures deepen queer and trans precarity. For too long now, either the figure of the trans and queer subject has become an aesthetic object of study and or been embroiled in questions of recognition and legal reforms. While I have no comments about the aesthetic angle, I think that the ball for recognition and legal reforms is now well on its way, and struggles for civil rights make little sense if questions of labor and livelihood are not upfront. Further, as trans activist Grace Banu reminded
Harika, I'm
us,
sorry if you can wind up now. I'm
Yes.
very sorry. Yeah.
I will wind up. Further, as trans activist Grace Banu reminds us, reservations in educational institutions and public offices will go a long way in ensuring the security of livelihood and work. This is perhaps one way to bring together, in Meg Weslin's words, the psychic realm of desire and the material realm of accumulation and exchange in understanding the world of labor in trans and queer persons' lives. Thank you.
Sincere apologies for asking you to stop that time. The issues you raised are just so fundamental. And of course, one is the invisibility or the lack of serious research on the issues which you have raised. But the other is a total a blindness in policy. I don't think there's any policy, which really takes these issues into account at all. I mean, if we see the labor codes and the definition of work and worker, I mean, there's nothing beyond male and female. The issues of security, work security, which you have raised, or sexual harassment, are all now separated from, the conditions of work, worker, and workplace. So the huge struggle, both theoretically and, of course, in terms of policy. Thank you so much. And again, apologies, because this was really quite fascinating. And I'll request Mahua to please start.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to share space with some of my favorite people here and to be a part of these discussions on this very valuable book. But before I share my thoughts on the book, I have, in the interest of full disclosure, I have certain things I must say. First, that as many here will agree, this is indeed a voluminous and a very dense book. And I must admit that I wasn't able to read all of it with equal attention and care. I think the last 5 chapters I sort of skimmed through. So I have read about the first 13 or 14. Second is that, I chanced upon a review of this book. Please don't judge. And I read it. The reason I bring up this review is that I would like to use something that was in there as a point of entry into what I want to say about the book. But before that, reading through the book, I really think of it as sort of peeling the layers of an onion. So I will talk about a few of the layers that I was able to uncover through my readings. So in this review that I chanced upon, the reviewer actually writes about her dilemma in her own workplace, which is a financial company, and how she had to give up her job in this company because, as she said, the company did not make space for her or understand and accommodate her personal problems. And these were her problems related to her health. So I think this book is fundamentally, for me, it was exciting because of the way in which the personal, intimate, and messy worlds of women's labor, their laboring bodies, along with the complex of affect, emotion, and identities are made legible throughout the book. I mean, whether you talk of the chapters that actually use ethnography and so on, or of the ones that use the historical method, or even the ones that are actually very conceptual. So this, for me, was the first exciting layer of the book, revealed through stories, narratives, and diverse contexts. Let me take a minute to just give a sense of this range. I think other people have also spoken about it. Shailesh Darokar writes poignantly about Dalit women working as manual scavengers. Madhumita Datta writes about the seemingly unencumbered lives that migrant factory girls manage to create through love, friendships, and limited financial control in response to the kind of restrictions at their homes. Meena Gopal draws on the lives of beedi workers through policy and legislative discussions that framed the beedi industry. Nandini Manjrekar draws our attention to the professional and personal identities of the lives of women teachers in the context of reforms in the education sector. So these are just a few of the examples that show the expansive focus of this volume. I'm always nervous when in a volume like this, it's always not nice to mention a few, but you get the sense that, you know, I want to give the sense of its expanse. So the second layer of the book for me is something that I think everybody has talked about before, but I would like to raise again, is the stated sort of methodological angle of interdisciplinarity and the lens of intersectionality. Now, to establish the relatedness of these two conceptual and methodological anchors requires, as the editors point out, more than just a sensitivity to diverse contexts. So it's not simply about visibilizing the invisible. The intent to actually go beyond this kind of magic wand categorization of intersectional analysis makes the volume quite a powerful reading of the concept. If the laboring bodies of Dalit women, young migrant factory girls, beedi workers, sex workers, surrogate mothers, artists, disabled women have disappeared at the intersections of class, caste, and gender, the volume tries to bring them back resolutely, not through a simple inclusion of the working lives of these women, but through a reworking of what their context might mean for the broader debates in issues of women's labor, and also hopefully to envision a transformative politics, what a transformative politics of labor and work might look like. So in this, I find that the introduction, as well as the conceptual chapters, such as the ones by Mary Jones, Shamita Sen, Rajni Palriwala, Renu Adlakha, are useful in showing that probing intersectionality is not just about multiple identities, as it often becomes. I mean, I know we are, when we as many of our research students are very quick to sort of use intersectionality, and they use it in the context of this multiple identity. So I think this volume is very, very valuable for research of that kind, which is trying to use the concept, but is doing it in this sort of obvious way. So the volume actually demonstrates these interlocking effects of structures on the different contexts of women's laboring bodies. While most of the essays point to this idea, I wondered if the volume could enable further methodological reflections on how the concept of intersectionality may be deployed in social science research. As a social anthropologist relying on fieldwork and narratives, how are the interlocking aspects of different axes of oppression to be uncovered, even as they're often presented and contexts, rendering ordered analysis very difficult. The ideas, I think, of embeddedness and networks could serve as crucial aids in this analytical chaos. How can one use these notions in conjunction with feminist methodologies, along with historical and archival work, and along with ethnographic research? I think these are questions that definitely the volume opens up, perhaps answers implicitly, and through a closer reading, I think that these answers, the volume can sort of seek to answer some of these questions. The third valuable layer for me is the way in which the domains of, and again, very sort of apparently different domains of care and work, emotion and labor, paid and unpaid work, and the home and the workplace are entangled through the stories that the book tells us. And again, the stories are through historical methods, through narratives, through conceptual terrains. Some of these conceptual terrains that the book delves into are division of labor, the economic value of work, governmentality, and neoliberal policies. With varying degrees of intensity, the chapters interrogate then the naturalization of the sexual /gender division of labor, the debates around domestic labor, and its place in the social reproduction of labor, and the linkages between work autonomy and freedom, showing us again that there are no sort of easy answers to any of these questions. Now, through this sort of engagement, I think the volume engages in a larger discussion on how these disciplines of history, sociology, social anthropology, feminist economics can actually enter the realm of policy and policy analysis. The fourth layer for me, interestingly, is something that Karuna has already touched upon, which is the issue of space. And I won't dwell on it long, but I just wanted to flag that the volume helps us traverse very different kinds of institutional and organizational spaces. And here again, I think it would be interesting to think about intersectional analysis and feminist methodologies and how they can be used, and they are used differently in these diverse spaces. So I'll stop here with this question. I think I've kept well to time. Those are my thoughts.
In fact, thank you, Moa. In fact, you still had another 2 minutes. So if you'd like to add on anything, or maybe later.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. We now have the second editor, Mary, who will now. You can appropriate 2 minutes of Moa's time if you want.
Well, thanks very much. This is a wonderful moment for us. I think Meena and many of our contributors and I, at some point along the way, weren't even sure whether we would reach this moment. And so it's truly a celebration for us. And I want to thank everyone. Partly, at one level, it was indeed sometimes frustrating. The actual conference took place in 2014. Then we had to, actually pull ourselves and say, yes, it's worth taking forward. And it was indeed the energy of many of our participants at the conference, and some who wished to be part of it and couldn't be part of it, who actually pushed us along. And then it was the next step of actually coming to Orient Black Swan and moving along and hitting the pandemic along the way. And I want to say that, yes, that was frustrating. But on the other hand, the slowness actually also had its positive value, because I think in the process of interacting with each other, Meena and I were in constant conversation, the process where our contributors brought their essays to the table and we had to rework them in conversation with them. Somehow I think that also added its own flavor, which is, I think, what we are hearing from some of you in terms of the panelists, because we hadn't, though we did have the exact same title in our conference, we were actually, it was more like a risk we were taking. We had no idea what it would actually yield. And so we had to actually make it work for us. We had to make these terms yield something along the way. So I really want to emphasize that this has been a collaborative and collective enterprise, just as I think we think politically. I think many of you have raised this question of what is the politics of women's labor. I would say, what's the politics of producing texts of this nature, of collaborative work in the times that we are in. Neoliberalism is not just at the level of where women find themselves in the workplace. It's at the level of us and our work as intellectual laborers of a certain kind, and the kind of forces that propel us one way or the other, and what we can do to deal with that and use it as well as resist it. So I value this endeavor for having enabled that kind of, whatever minor level of academic production, of having given us an example of what can be done. Many of you have raised very important questions, and good questions don't have quick answers. That's what a good question is. I hope, and I'm very excited to sense from all of you that you've actually got what it is we were trying to do. I mean, sometimes one does something and then you think people haven't got it, but you've got it. So that's a tremendous positive for us. And it's only through further work of this nature, engaging with us, disagreeing with us, perhaps in places as well. I think that's absolutely needed in the times we're in, that will actually take us forward. So thanks. I just want to say thanks to everyone. Thanks to those of the contributors who could make it today. Some of you were not in a position to come, but many of you have come. Thank you. And thanks to Orient Black Swan for keeping with us till the end.
Mary, I must say this is probably the most efficient panel I've seen, because everyone seems to have, finished whatever they had to say in time. So we really have some time more for discussion. There are, I think, 2 questions which have been typed out, and if there are any more, we can get into that. So shall we take these 2 first? Yes, one is, does the book incorporate the participation of transgender in skill development programs to ensure economic empowerment? So that's one question. Another one which has come in is, what about women with disabilities? Has that issue been addressed in the book? So that's 2. And there's another one on the care economy, which is, I think, a longer point. So maybe we can take that a bit later. Mary, who would like to answer that? Any of the panelists here who would like to, who have worked on it?
Well, actually, we have chapters on each of these. So
yeah,
I was wondering, is this an invitation to read the chapters or speak to them? Maybe the panelists would like to answer.
Niharika, maybe you'd like to take one of the 2? Mary, are any of the panel authors here of these different chapters? You think they can participate in this?
I was thinking if any of the authors could.
Yes. I think, well, on the women with disabilities, we have Renu. I think Renu is here. If Renu can unmute, then it would be wonderful if Renu were to speak to that question. We have Rajni on care economy. So I think at least 2 of our contributors are with us.
Yeah, so Renu, are you able to connect with her?
Can you hear me?
Or
Yes,
unmute
Renu.
her?
Yes, Renu.
Yes, Renu, we can hear you.
Okay, so I mean, this is a question which is there. I mean, it's one of the chapters which is addressed in this, and this is an area where.
Renu, can you put on your video? That would be really nice, if possible.
Okay, nothing much, but yeah, sure. Okay.
Oh, great, great. Yeah. Thanks.
So, so there is a chapter on women with disabilities in India. That area is really an unfolding area because, it's not established area of employment because of the disjunct between work and disability, meaning work, the disability being almost like a disqualifier from productive labor, which is like one of the, it kind of grew up as a concept at a point when the division between unproductive and productive people in the context of the Industrial Revolution was taking shape. So this is a very unexplored area. The levels of employment of women with disabilities in the formal sector is low. So it's almost like, almost invisible. But within the informal sector, as in the case of, invisible categories of people, people with disabilities, including women with disabilities, are workers. There are a lot of them. In addition to domestic work and, in addition to housework, and care work and reproductive work, women with disabilities, particularly in rural areas, are actively engaged in the economy in whatever level their capacity to function allows them to be so. And I think it's an area that really requires not only, yes, at an intersectional level, and that is very correct, but even per se as a category, as a conceptual category, I think that that area needs to be further explored. And I think there is some work on it, but it's still very limited. Unlike, feminist economics, where there is more focus on women's labor, and there's some amount of work that's come out on other marginalized communities. But I think after queer people, people with disabilities and women with disabilities, the the level of output is very low. And I really look forward to this chapter, at least if this book becomes part of curriculum in the university level. I really look forward to this area actually being explored in a beyond the stereotypes and beyond the discrimination, prejudice paradigm that we have for marginalized groups and people with disabilities. And when we look at all domains of their life, but I think we really need to look at it in terms of actually what is the productivity of women with disabilities. Very hard questions. And I think it's not that people with disabilities and women with disabilities are not engaged in the labor market, which is the common stereotyped and understanding. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Renu. This thing about productivity is an issue which bothers a whole lot of us feminist economists, because the calculation and the meaning of productivity by itself is extremely problematic. So that is, I think, one issue which needs a lot of research for sure. There was another question. I think maybe somebody, Sri Rekha, is in for the discussion for an issue.
No.
Yeah, I'm here.
Because there's Meena, you have requested that she be on the panel. Yeah, so should we have her now to specifically discuss the issue? Meena?
No, she was just invited into as a panelist as well as the authors.
Okay.
That's how it was. Yeah.
All right. And
I think there's a question on the care economy. So may I request Rajni to respond?
Rajni's made a co-host.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for
Yes.
asking me to respond, and thank you to everyone who's here, Ritu, for chairing. The question is way too large to be able to address over here. What I would suggest is that maybe it's a cop-out to say, well, please read the section in the chapter by me, as well as a lot of the huge amount of work which there is on this. So I'll try and address it in maybe 5 sentences to say that, well, the care economy, as most people will know, as it exists today, is imbued with all the structures of exploitation and oppression, which the economy at the larger level is, but with maybe many of the aspects intensified, because it also rests on the devaluation of what has been historically women's work within the home, the care work. And that with neoliberalism in particular across the world, the idea that the care economy would solve all the problems has been pushed. And I think it's in that light we have to see it. What we can see in the Indian context is the expansion of and this is not necessarily in the article, but the expansion of the care economy as far as domestic workers is concerned is often being enabling not the participation of more women in paid work, but is often serving classes where women may not be in paid work, in fact, so that the hierarchies which there are between women in terms of caste and class are very important. The one interesting thing which emerges over there is that because of the increasing demand for domestic work, sometimes lines of caste and religion get fuzzy. People they want the worker as long as they can pretend they don't know which caste they come from. However, the care economy is, of course, not just domestic workers. And we see this very clearly during the pandemic, because the care economy is also about health workers. It's about sanitation workers who are also overworked, undervalued, and who really during the pandemic, we saw how they suffered. So is the care economy essential let me go back to what the question said. Is there a necessity for a care economy? Yes, there is, but on completely different lines of how the care economy is thought of in terms of most of the discussions as something which will just open up work avenues for women. What will it mean for women's labor participation? Well, as it's been pointed out, in the West, it certainly seems to, through the care chains, seems to have helped women participate in outside work. In the Indian context, the care economy has, in a sense, has long existed within the feudal system and the caste system without necessarily enabling work, except for those who are the care workers at very low wages. So, okay, it's difficult to say anything more without, at this time. I have to also say one more thing. This article was initially written long ago. And after that, most of the work I've done on it is how to cut it down, how to cut it down, how to cut it down. So I have, and I think that may have happened with many of us. With 19 articles, Mary and Veena had to keep asking us, cut, cut, cut. So please read the book, but please read what the book directs you also to or suggests to you beyond the book. Thank you.
Rajni, that was it's a very huge question. In fact, maybe we can have a 3-day conference on this. A lot more to say. I was really desperate to add on, so maybe in the end I will say something on this issue. There are 2 more questions. One is on the issue of trade unions. Veena, Maya, particularly the one written by Sujata Gutaskar. So would anyone like to take that on? Is Sujata here?
No,
panelist?
Sujata's not here. She was unable, she's traveling, so she's unable to attend today.
So would either of you like to, because you have been through the various avatars of that article. So
well, I can just only say that Sujata has drawn from her experience of being both part of the women's movement as well as the labor movement, a sort of 40-year history that she's tried to draw through, and spoken essentially about the initial the tensions about organizing women, and then how women have had to organize separately, and her own learnings through this process. And she sort of ends with her example of working with the tea garden workers, and the way in which the precarity of both the male workers and their families and the women workers in the tea gardens really contribute to a sort of flattening out in that sense of the power of unions, but still have they been struggling. But would Karuna like to add something?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, can I add something?
Yeah,
sure.
Because I think, I mean, that article and also the other articles on collectivization, organizing women and all are very important. And in a sense, Sujata's article actually makes the link, looks at it historically also, and not just in the present. So I think there's so much more that needs to be done, because I mean, often we are kind of focused on current forms of mobilization, whether it is through, I mean, new kind of unions like Seva, or whether it is through SHGs and stuff. And somehow there is a kind of impression that, oh, women are all in the informal sector, oh, they are all unorganized, oh, they need to be organized. Whereas there is a whole history, there's quite a rich history of organization, I think, which needs to be unearthed. But it's not a romantic or an easy history. It's also a history of failures often, or of being sidelined, marginalized. And maybe from the standpoint of women workers trying to mobilize, I think that kind of a standpoint would also be useful in interrogating larger, worker politics, trade union mobilization. I think, I think the standpoint of women workers also needs to be used to kind of interrogate meta-narratives. I mean, I like that in Samita Sen's article also, that she kind of says that feminist historiography has been successful in, say, interrogating meta-narratives of the nation and of nationalism. But how far, I think we need to work more on in labor, and using women's labor and work to kind of interrogate both meta-narratives of capitalism on the one hand, but also meta-narratives of workers' history, mobilization. And I think those articles, especially Sujata's, is a starting point for something like that.
Can I just add to that, just to respond to the question on unions? I think the article just, it begins very well by talking about some of the limitations that women experience in sort of participating in union activities. It also then highlights, for instance, some of the exclusions of, practiced by unions themselves. So for instance, along lines of caste, where, often sort of some forms of labor are considered to be exploitative, but exploitative as pre-capitalist forms of exploitation. So, so it highlights those. And the third thing I think it does is also that it focuses on sort of the globalization of trade union activity, and how the discourses around decent work and discourses around wages at a global level then enter into unionizing and organizing and collectivizing for women workers. So I think these are the three, and specifically through pharmaceuticals and workers, and the second is, I think Meena mentioned, I'm forgetting, the tea garden workers. She uses those as examples to highlight some of these issues.
I was wondering if Sri Rekha would like to add, because she actually has a very specific chapter on the Anganwadi workers, a very interesting case. Sri Rekha, would you like to add a sentence or two, time permitting?
I think 10 minutes is what we have. So she would like, and there's one more question by Razia, which is there, which she has put. So is Sri Rekha there? Ah, there she is. Yes, please.
Well, I haven't really thought of anything at the moment to add. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay, we'll then take up Razia's question. She would like to know the opinion from the author that the status of employment in the world of work, especially in the informal sector, is a source of discrimination, abuse, and workplace violence. Is this because of the women-led employment in the informal sector? Is there anyone who would like to take this up?
I didn't fully understand the question. Is the question saying that there are more women in informal labor and therefore there's a problem?
That itself is a form of discrimination.
Well, I think, basically almost all women are in the, I mean, we've used that tiny little 6%
worlds of work.
I mean, it's 94% women are in so-called informal. I mean, informal actually is one of those, Potman, I don't know what to call it. It's one of those sacks, if you like. It's not really a concept, which actually encompasses almost everyone. So I think we need to be more careful. It's a word that gets used a lot. And I think it's actually, and it's not a word we unpack in our book. I think that's a shortcoming. I think there may be a definition for formality up to a point, but there is really no definition for except negatively. Informality is too huge a category. It encompasses most of the work that women do. It basically means that you're outside existing labor laws and existing forms of recognized organization. So I think maybe one would need to be a little more specific about maybe sectors and so on. Otherwise, it seems very, very enormous kind of question. It's asking a question about everyone.
Can I just come in on this?
Sure, Rajni.
Yeah, just 1 minute, sorry. But the time issue. Yeah, Rajni?
Just a quick comment. we have to remember that it's not just women, now 94% of women who are in what is called the informal sector. It's with men also, it's well over 90% that they're in the informal sector. And I think the question we need to ask is not the informal sector, but why does this, what we call the informal sector, emerge? And why does it grow in this period? And that it is defined to be more oppressive because it's defined not to have those systems of protection. So, and more abusive and everything else. It's meant to be like that.
Yeah, exactly. And getting more and more problematic by the day. I think I just like to add on here the issue of the labor codes, I think on which enough work has not been done, because even whatever minimal laws existed have now all been withdrawn. So your definition of work, workplace takes anybody who's out of employment in the context of an establishment, So others who are out of an establishment context are really out of any kind of future or present security or whatever it is. So you have domestic workers who are out of it. You have your Sumangali workers who are out of it. Apprentices, this huge category, home-based work production. So, and that's a huge amount of men and of course a very, very high percentage of women. Plus you have things like sexual harassment, which are now out of safe situations. Your hours of work have changed, etc. So, this thing of informality is, it's like, I think it's increasing not only because of the entire growth process or the pattern of growth or de-development, what I say, but it's also increasing legally, and which is a very, problematic issue in a democracy in particular. We'll end here. I think that's almost all the questions which have been taken. And I think we've had a very, very rich discussion. And in fact, I'm very tempted to say that maybe 6 months later, we should visit some of these issues when more people have read the book. It'll be interesting, especially the ones on disability and queer, etc., etc. So that is something which I feel could be done. Now, for me, when I read the book, there were 3 issues of debate which came to me, some of which have been covered, of course. One is, the issue of intersectionality, and which has come out really very well, is so the intersectionality of issues, okay, which, like I said, have been dealt with, that can they also be linked, or should they be linked in a broader, in a later context? I'm not saying right now. There's not a critique, it's an issue of debate, I think, which came very strongly to my mind after I read the book. So to connect with the intersectionality of rights and struggles, that component for me is something where I think we really need to work a bit harder as researchers, whether it's as economists or historians or sociologists or anthropologists or whatever. So linking, and very much as trade union activists or activists. So the issue of linking up academics and action, which has come out very strongly in the book, and extending it beyond in terms of movements. So that for me is rights and movements, that interconnection, which is a very fluid kind of an interconnection. That was one issue. Secondly, paid and unpaid work. I mean, several of us have been working on this for quite some time. And what we call the work continuum. It's, you don't know where your paid work starts and your unpaid work ends. It's just fluid in terms of whether it's time or it's multiplicity of activities or synchronity of activities. So, you're drawing water while feeding the child, etc., etc. And I'm not talking only about care, domestic work. I'm talking even of so-called that word productive, in terms of contribution to the Indian economy. And therefore, maybe redefining, re-seeing, reanalyzing, even things like care work. Because children, not to be seen as children, but to be seen as the future workforce. So really does not the state have a role to play in reducing the care work component? And this is what I find, in several studies. I've gone through, I think, almost the studies which have existed on paid and unpaid. And I find some of these issues a little problematic, because can we apply then and the concepts of exchange value and use value to the concepts of paid and unpaid work in a very broad kind of a theoretical context, and do this in an economy which is on the path of degrowth? It's actually declining. And this is not only because of the pandemic, it's been there for the last several years, in terms of employment, in terms of female labor work participation rate, in terms of us having the lowest wages in South Asia, the lowest minimum wages in South Asia. And of course, now the NFHS data, which has come in terms of anemia and nutrition and various other stunting, wasting, all these issues which are interconnected. And link this up with the neoliberal appropriation of the means of production. I think that is something. So, the issues of monetization, the issues of control over CPRs, of our common property resources, whether they're urban or whether they are rural. And this kind of a broader, because I'm an economist, I find this is extremely important, the fiscal and monetary architecture too, very much so. So does the Reserve Bank's monetary policy on non-inflation targeting, and we have now one of the highest inflation targeting. How does that impact the care economy? And how does that impact, of course, the paid economy? And which we know that the paid economy cannot exist unless there is an unpaid economy. It rests on the shoulders of an unpaid economy. And therefore, the issue, one aspect, one statement which I found in the book, which I would really like a much greater debate on at some other point, is that it is said that it is argued that one of the greatest shortcomings in current approaches to women's labor is the over-focus on poverty. And therefore, this devisibilizes the fact that the patriarchal household is the major site of analysis of constraints on women's participation in the labor force. Now, I am certainly not refuting the intra-household differences or the micro level of what goes on or the power relations within the house. But but I find this somewhat similar to behavioral economics. It's that the problem and therefore the resolution of the problem lies within the household. Now, that is one aspect, but also it lies very, very much in the context of the state, whether the state is investing in public provisioning, is it withdrawing from public provisioning, is it, an increasingly exclusionary state? And I'm saying this over a period of time, but particularly I think we see in the last few years. So you have this increasingly exclusionary state, and which cannot survive. And this, I think, is something which is so vivid with what is happening now, that unless the patriarchal rigidities and patriarchal inequalities and economic inequalities are interlinked and strengthened. So for me, as an economist, this broader context also becomes extremely essential as a point of debate at some other point. So I'd like to thank you all for this. Really learned a lot from reading the book, learned a lot from the kind of debate which has taken place today. And I think the level of the debate is something which is extremely commendable. And I think it reflects on the way the book has been written, the way the book has been conceived and visualized. I think that is also something which is extremely important. And my only complaint is that the time is not enough. So next time, maybe we should extend it by at least 20 minutes to half an hour. Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much for this.
Thank you very much, Professor Devan, for chairing this evening's very exciting discussion. And a very big thank you to all our wonderful panelists, Professors Meena Gopal, Karuna Vilenga, Niharika Banerjee, Moa Bandyopadhyay, and Mary John, for that extremely informative and engaging discussion on a subject that is not only critically important, but also informs our everyday lives. A special thank you to all the contributing authors of the volume for making time this evening to be part of our panel and for your participation. I would also like to thank all members of our audience who joined us on Zoom and those watching this discussion live on YouTube. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you also to all colleagues at Orient Black Swan for your support and help in making today's event a success. Those who could not join us this evening can listen to the discussion on our YouTube channel, where all our previous discussions and webinars have been archived. Thank you all once again, and I wish everyone a very pleasant evening and weekend ahead. Goodbye and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.